For more, let's go to Minneapolis in the United States. Academic Arian Zenz is the author of Tibetanness Under Threat. Thank you for speaking with us on France 24. Concretely,
thank you.
What evidence do we have as to how big these re-education centers, or whatever the vocational, what is it they called exactly? Hold on, I said it a minute ago. Vocational training centers. How big is the scale?
The scale is not easy to assess because obviously China does not officially publish a lot of data on the scale or on the number of persons detained. However, we do have extensive documentation, especially from previous years, that were released by local county authorities and prefecture authorities, particularly between 2014 and 16. These documents speak quite extensively about the structure and the increasing institutionalization of an extensive re-education network. And in about 2017, this initiative was merged with a drive to provide vocational training. And in about March 2017, there's eyewitness evidence of thousands of people disappearing, being gathered up. We then have an increase in government procurement and construction bids that indicate that these camps have been constructed, or existing facilities such as schools have been converted into re-education facilities on multiple administrative levels.
22 million people live in Xinjiang province, half of them Uighur Muslims. Do we have any idea, since this all began, what the effects of this policy by Beijing have been?
There's anecdotal and eyewitness evidence of the impact. We do know also from visitors that the re-education drive is instilling a great amount of fear into the population. There's a real atmosphere of fear, very much, of course, inside these camps, and former instructors have spoken out on that matter, but also in the general Xinjiang society. Now, some evidence from those who have been inside the camps and were able not only to be released or to escape, but also to leave China, were able to speak out more freely on their personal experiences. These persons have reported in some instances that they are suffering from memory loss. Memory loss is a classic post-traumatic stress disorder. This is very much what we can expect from intensified indoctrination, where the conditions of when a person can be released or the time when they can be released is unknown, which is one of the worst things that can happen to normal people who are suddenly swept up and detained. We can expect that this campaign is causing a lot of trauma and a lot of broken identities among the Muslim minority populations.
And within that Muslim minority populations, there are radicals. Arian Zenz, journalists have seen Uyghurs fighting in Syria in some instances, although they may be small in numbers. What kind of a boomerang effect can we expect?
Now, China does have, to an extent, a legitimate terror threat, as you have mentioned, although organized resistance has basically been squashed and destroyed. Now, some Uyghurs outside of China, as you have mentioned, have radicalized themselves, and there have been threats to return to China and to launch some kind of war against Chinese authorities in order to what they call freeing their home country. In actual reality, the actual threat emanating from these groups is probably fairly small. China has invested very heavily in securing this region, in securing its borders. It is using high-tech tools, high-tech surveillance. It is installing extensive border controls, fences, and multiple layers of security. In contrast, these fighters who have radicalized themselves and have now some fighting experience are actually fairly limited in number, and their level of organization is likely not particularly high. So really no match for the well-armed and well-organized Chinese security authorities.
Arian Zenz, when you compare the treatment of Uyghur Muslims with Tibetan Buddhists or Christian minorities elsewhere, the authorities in Beijing, do they have the same attitude towards religious minorities, whoever they may be?
In ultimate essence, the answer must be yes. Any religion is suspect to a communist or quasi-socialist regime. These ideologies, religious ideologies, have long been considered a threat and a competition to a party that is officially atheist. And to the great surprise or perplexity of the Chinese state, the communist prophecy that religions will eventually fade or subside with material progress and economic growth has not materialized. Quite to the contrary, religions across China, be it Buddhism, Christianity, and also Islam, have witnessed a strong resurgence after the reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping. We now see a very strong increase in the repression of religions, be it Christian house churches, be it Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, be it Islamic mosques and locations. However, what we see in Xinjiang specifically is unprecedented in terms of oppression and crackdown, and that is simply because Uyghur Muslim groups have been able to launch violent attacks outside of Xinjiang, carried the struggle for against oppression and for an independent country to an extent outside their own region. Now, Tibetans have self-immolated, meaning they have burned themselves, which to a large extent has not affected other Han. Uyghurs have carried out violent attacks against Chinese police stations and against Chinese citizens, which has forced the government into action on a different scale.
Arian Zenz, the author of Tibetanness Under Threat, many thanks for joining us from Minneapolis in Minnesota.